Welcome to the Unconventional Dyad podcast, where you'll find broad topics, an unconventional dyad, and one shared goal, educating ourselves through challenging and engaging conversations. Your hosts are Carly and Laura, two graduate students and friends committed to having discussions that are real, raw, and unpolished. Thank you for joining us. Hello everyone, welcome to episode 11 of the Unconventional Dyad podcast. Today we have Angela Lang as our guest on the episode. Angela is the founder and executive director of Black Leaders Organizing for Community, also known as BLOC. She was born and raised in the heart of Milwaukee, and she has extensive background in community organizing. In the past, Angela served as both an organizer and state council director for the Service Employees International Union, working on such campaigns as the Fight for 15. Before joining BLOC's team as executive director, Angela was the political director with For Our Future Wisconsin. She is a graduate of Emerge Wisconsin and has had the pleasure of being the featured trainer for Emerge's Diversity Weekend since 2015. Angela is motivated by making substantial and transformative change in her community while developing young local leaders of color. Her journey in organizing hasn't always been easy, but through it all, she has remained a fierce advocate for securing more seats at the table for those who represent the new American majority. Today's topics of discussion include Angela's social justice work and activism, more specifically her work with BLOC. We also discuss prioritizing mental health and self-care in the workplace, as well as the pervasive nature of trauma and its impact on communities of color. We also discussed the impacts of COVID-19 and the racism pandemic, and it was a really wonderful episode. We really hope you enjoy this one. And as always, if you like what you're hearing, please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. We would especially appreciate it if you could rate and review on Apple Podcast, as that really gets the podcast a little more visible and we get more listeners that way. So thank you so much for your continued support. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Angela, thank you so much for being here on the Unconventional Dyad podcast. We're super excited to have you.
Yeah.
To start off, please just tell us a little bit about yourself, maybe your personal and professional identities, anything you want to let our listeners know.
Yeah, so I'm 31, born and raised in Milwaukee, have literally never lived anywhere else. So really strong Milwaukee roots. It's a choice at this point. I was one of those people after high school, I wanted to move far away and get out of my hometown. And that just didn't work out for me. And, staying here was probably one of the best decisions I ever made. I got really involved in student organizing. I feel like I learned a lot about organizing. I got a crash course. I was doing a lot of nonpartisan work with the ACLU at the time at UW Milwaukee. And then 2010 happened and Scott Walker was elected and things got a little different for our state. And so I learned even a bigger crash course in organizing there. And then after I left UWM, I scrambled to find a job. I started to learn more about what organizing is, knowing that it could be a career, and that, you can actually do it full time, and it's not just something you do in your spare time. And so my first job out of college was for the Service Employees International Union. A lot of labor organizing and kind of a lot of the political organizing as well. We had members that were directly impacted with the living wage ordinance at the county. So doing a lot of work on the political process there and learned a lot about labor organizing. 2016 happened, the election happened, and I had worked for an organization called For Our Future at the time, which sole purpose was to elect Hillary Clinton at the time. And I was like, okay, I'm out of a job. I got to find something else. But I had been venting and ranting about all of the ways that people's analysis was off in the 2016 election. Everyone wanted to blame our community, knowing that we're some of the most disenfranchised and least engaged. And it was very frustrating to see everyone point their finger at us when turnout was down almost everywhere. It was down all across the state, and it was down in several places across the country. but only our community was being targeted, it felt like. So some folks kind of got in a room and we said, what do we do to fix this, to make sure that we're not waiting for people to engage us? Let's do that work ourselves. Let's do it on a year-round basis, so it's not just a couple weeks or a couple months before an election. Really kind of taking the lessons learned and some of the gaps and holes in traditional electoral organizing and wanting to do that differently, and trying to be creative with it. And almost 3 years later, Block is here and has made some big adjustments in 2020, but it allowed us to dig deeper into the work and learn more and get creative, and also be, creative in how we're supporting each other too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Can you tell our listeners about Block, just like goals, mission, vision, that kind of thing?
Yeah, so Block was founded in November of 2017. We took some time to reflect after the 2016 election. And, we said that we were going to engage folks from our own community. We were going to have an ongoing civic engagement conversation. We're going to expand the idea of civic engagement. So it's not just voting. It's being able to call your legislator. It's showing up at a city budget hearing and testifying where you think your tax dollars should go. There's so many different ways to be civically engaged that I think a lot of people don't always realize. And we want to make sure, again, we're empowering our community to have those conversations. So we consider ourselves a year-round civic engagement organization. We are really, 2020 aside, we're really known for a really robust and aggressive field program. We typically would be on doors in between election cycles. So in 2019, when it was rather quiet, we still had almost 20 of our ambassadors still knocking on doors, building relationships. So, again, kind of filling those gaps where people kind of pack up and go home. We're there on a year-round basis to really kind of bring people along on their civic engagement journey.
Mm-hmm. What do the ambassadors kind of do on their field placements? Can you give us the details of that?
Yeah, so our ambassador program is split into two parts. We have our civic ambassador program, which is our nonpartisan program, and that's typically in between election cycles when we're not talking about politics, we're not talking about, the election, digging into people's issues, trying to organize around them. Last year in 2019, our folks were in small teams, and each team was responsible for their own geographic boundaries, and they worked that area from April all the way to December, and they were a constant presence. They were knocking on doors, asking folks, what does it look like for the Black community to thrive? And some people were saying, oh, well, we want a speed bump over here. They're like, oh, your neighbor 3 houses down also said that, speeding on this neighborhood is a big issue. Have y'all talked about this? No? Oh, how about we get like a neighborhood meeting together? I can help kind of bring folks together. We did a lot of cookouts. We did a lot of, games with kids and, just trying to bring the community together. So that's our nonpartisan ambassador program. And our electoral ambassador program is where we advocate for the candidates that have gone through our endorsement process that we think are best for our community. But something that's part of both of those programs is we always start with the question, what does it look like for the Black community to thrive? Because we know that even when we're having, some of the more partisan conversations, we want to show up as full people. We don't want to just exclusively say, hey, vote for this person. We want to do some of that deeper education. Why should someone care about the sheriff? What's the difference between the sheriff and the police chief? Why should we care about the DA? Why should we care about the state Supreme Court if we're likely never going to go in front of them? Doing some of that education on doors as well. We try not to lead with candidates because sometimes candidates in and of themselves are not always enough to move people. They're not exciting enough to move people, but we want people to understand the roles and responsibilities and the jurisdictions of the offices of the people that we're trying to elect, so people have a deeper understanding of the political system too.
Wow, very cool. That sounds like a lot of work.
It is. I mean, it's something that, a lot of people say all the time, oh, you're doing the thing that we talk about all the time. And I realize why people don't do it. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of effort. It takes resources, and it takes a lot of commitment. We said that we were going to prioritize our field program. So that meant that we had a bare bones staff, but we had, a big ambassador team so they could be out in the field and talking to folks. There's organizations bigger than us, have more resources than us, have been around longer than us. But at the same time, for us, we made it a priority in our budget and just in our values that we wanted to do that year-round engagement. And we're going to take that time to do it. And it's possible if others want to do that as well.
Mm-hmm. Who typically gets involved with Block? Like, what kind of individuals do you see coming in to work for Block?
Yeah, so right now we have a waiting list. We're actually really proud of the fact that we don't have to advertise a lot. I know some folks have to like do paid advertising, but we have a waiting list. It's folks that, word of mouth at this point. It's,
Mhm.
typically when we were on doors, there would be times our team members would knock on a door and they said, I want to do what you're doing. You seem really
Mhm.
knowledgeable. How can I, do what you're doing? There's some folks on our team now that are with us because someone knocked on their door. And then, kind of word of mouth, their friends and family, neighbors, and other folks in their network. And so, these are folks that are all a part of the Black community. I'm very special and very lucky that I get to go to work every day surrounded with members of my own community. So everybody identifies as Black. Everyone lives in Milwaukee and has deep ties to Milwaukee. It's a multi-range. We have a lot of younger folks
Mhm.
in their early 20s, and we have a lot of older folks, mid, 40s and 50s. And it's interesting to see kind of some of the intergenerational dialogue happening. We tell people all the time we're not a youth-centered organization. We like to hype up our friends over at Leaders Igniting Transformation, but we do have a lot of young people that kind of gravitate towards us. Some of the folks on my team unfortunately haven't had their voting rights restored yet, but yet are still knocking and encouraging everyone else to vote. These are folks that have gone through severe challenges. I think a lot of us in our community has. We realize what our triggers are when we're constantly seeing new videotapes of people being murdered. So we're trying to heal and grieve and kind of come together, but we in some way we're a family. We text each other every morning, good morning, in our massive 80 plus person group chat. And it's a really special dynamic. And I think it's a place where people can come to be full people, and they don't need to kind of check, their trauma or, you know, kind of the joke about calling in Black because there's another video and you're like, I don't know if I can go to work and deal with all my white coworkers. We can kind of just be and grieve and heal and kind of have that family dynamic. And that's our team. We're tell people all the time, we are not perfect by any means. We're rough around the edges, but in the most beautiful and genuine way.
Yeah, that sounds like a really safe space for people.
I hope it is that, that's what we try to do. Again, we're not perfect, but we're able to, have learning experiences and teachable moments if need be. And I think, just like family, we disagree sometimes. Now that it's getting closer to the election, we feel that our tensions are high. But even when we disagree, we're able to kind of talk it out. We're able, when we were in person and we had disagreements, I'd be like, all right, everyone in the big room, we're sitting in a circle. I got a talking stick and we're going to talk this out, and we're going to, we're going to cry and we're going to hug it out until we're done. And so hopefully, even when we have our disagreements, I think that we've built such a strong bond with our team that when we have disagreements, we'll get over it just like family does, but we're going to be mad in the moment, but we'll be fine
Mhm.
ultimately because we know that we share the same vision and goal too.
That's beautiful. Is the safety piece and kind of what you described, like the culture of your organization, was that like super intentional from the beginning? Did it kind of come as you went along and figured things out?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both. I knew I wanted to do things differently. I knew I wanted a more of a supportive culture. I kept thinking to myself, what would I have wanted as a new organizer, as a baby organizer, learning in this process? What would I have wanted? And also kind of just like, well, who says we can't have a therapist? Who says we
Mhm.
can't, move to 4-day work weeks and have Fridays off? Like, who says, right? So being able to try and figure out what works best for the team. So I knew I wanted to be supportive and really acknowledge the trauma and just how hard this work can be. I knew I wanted to acknowledge that and center that. I just didn't know how. And I think it's kind of evolved into radical honesty. I try to show up in a way to the team where I don't have this mystery doctor's appointment on my calendar. It says therapy. I tell people I'm going to therapy. I'll be back in an hour, right? Like trying to destigmatize some of these conversations, but then also just figuring out what works for all of us and being able to just effectively communicate. Shortly after the protests in Minnesota happened, I remember texting the senior team and I was like, how are y'all feeling today? And it was like 7 in the morning and they all texted me back. It was very clear none of us slept that night. And, after talking to them, we all agreed we're going to take a mental health day. And so,
Mhm.
it's kind of just being able to address the needs of the team. I think for me, I'm always trying to find other ways, We have our Wellness Wednesdays where we acknowledge it and we encourage kind of this midweek reset. It's a little hard to do it virtually, but just trying to find other ways. I'm always trying to think about who can we bring in? Can we bring in someone to do some healing or some trauma therapy? But trying to make that kind of a regular thing, and hopefully be an example for other organizations too.
That's amazing. I'm really encouraged by how you emphasize and destigmatize mental health and mental wellness. Carly and I are both studying clinical psychology in grad school, and I'm sure Carly feels the same way. It's just so important for workplaces especially to do that. And I honestly have not heard of anything quite like this at any other organization. I think that's pretty incredible that you do that kind of work.
Yeah, I mean, there's been times when we were in the office, if I, schedule my therapy in the middle of the day, I'll let folks know, like, hey, I'll be back in an hour. And there's one time I came back and I always try to grab some business cards on my way back, right? And I tell folks, I'm like, if folks are interested, at the corner of my desk, if you want to talk about it, I'm here. If you just want to grab one and don't want me to know, that's fine too. But they're here. And then they naturally disappear a few days later. I remember one time there's a group of our more so younger ambassadors came up to me and said, Angela, can we talk to you about your therapy session? Like, what's your experience like? And I was like, yeah, come in, let's close the door, let's have a conversation. And so I think it's just trying to be that example to kind of break those walls down, so people know that they can heal, they can grieve, they can, handle their emotions in a healthy way. And we don't need to bottle them up, because that's also killing us. Like, that added stress is not helping, and as we're constantly being traumatized in real time in the year of 2020.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mentioned having a therapist on staff and a 4-day work week. Can you talk a little bit about those two things?
Yes, we don't have a therapist on staff yet. It was written into the budget. We wanted to do that this year. COVID threw a wrench in a lot of our plans. We wanted to have the goal ultimately at one point is to have, at least a part-time therapist, 2 or 3 times a week that kind of holds these office hours. And then, if people want to utilize them, then they're there, and they can schedule appointments. And that's the goal ultimately one day. I think it's always best in person, but we still have to figure out the virtual setting. And then, shortly after the protests happened and the murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, it was around the time, I think it was like Memorial Day, there was an extended, weekend, and we were like, oh, the extended weekend felt good. And then, then we ended up taking that mental health day, I think maybe a week or 2 later. And then we said, these 3-day weekends, they actually feel like normal weekends, because a lot of us end up having to work or do other things on Saturdays or Sundays. So it doesn't always feel like we get a weekend. So we talked it out, and I just said, for the immediate future, let's just do this. I put an away message on. I had to put it on the team's calendar. We've been doing this a couple months now, but I actually had to put it on their calendar a couple weeks ago because they kept forgetting it. We're not good at it, but I think what we say is that I don't expect anything from anyone on Fridays. I'm not going to ask anything. I'm not going to schedule anything. But people can use their Fridays for what they want. If they are just like, you know what, I'm not going to take any calls, but I'm going to catch up on emails, and I'm going to catch up on plan writing or grants, or someone just wants to lay in bed all day. I was like, your Fridays are whatever you want to do. I know myself, there are things, if I can't schedule it during the rest of the week, I'll schedule something on a Friday. My Fridays are really consumed with what I want to do, which allows me to do some of that work that really makes me happy. And it allows me to like read and not feel like I have to respond to emails every 5 minutes too. So it's, it's different for everybody, but hoping that people can, feel less pressure to have to respond to everything all the time, and can, take that day of rest if they need to.
Mm-hmm. Have you noticed any tangible effects of that already, of taking that 4-day week?
I mean, I think everyone likes it. I think everybody feels that it's better. And it allows them the space to breathe, even if, they do end up doing work. Like, I know myself, I work every Friday. I do my weekly emails. I do, a few things and get caught up on some admin stuff. But I think, it allows us to slow down. It allows us to not feel the pressure. And then also, for me, I notice people communicate with me differently. If people know that I'm off on Fridays, then they ask stuff of me during the week, or they're like, you know what, Angela's not going to see this email till Monday anyway, so I'm just not going to send it until Monday. So, I think people are adjusting, and I think hopefully other people are having those conversations about if that's something that they can implement in their organization, that, this organization that is, under a lot of pressure in a lot of different ways, under a lot of different challenges. Understanding the nature of the work that we do is talking to Black voters in a swing state. If we, feel that immense amount of pressure, if we can move to 4-day work weeks and kind of change this culture of campaigning and how we do electoral work, then that means I think anyone can. And we could just find ways to think outside of the box. Like, we shouldn't be limited in our thinking of this is what we've always done. Try new things. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work, but try to figure out what works best for your team.
Yeah. Yeah, that's super inspiring. I think COVID has already kind of shifted people's mindsets a little bit. Yeah. Hopefully there's going to be some long-lasting changes from it, but that's super inspiring that you implemented that so quickly and that it's worked for you. You've already touched on this a little bit, but I'm wondering if you can speak more specifically about the impacts that COVID-19 has had on your work, on your organization, and also the racism pandemic, how that's impacted your work and organization.
Yeah, I think for both of those things, it's been traumatic for all of us. Like, we're all being traumatized in real time. I don't know if we have enough of those conversations or if we have enough of the healing collectively, like as a country, on both of those issues. So I think that's a challenge in itself. I think specifically when it comes to COVID, with our team, we have a rather large team right now with 2020 and all of our ambassadors. So we have 73 ambassadors and like 9 full-time staff. So we're a pretty big team right now. And every time there is a tragedy that strikes in Milwaukee, usually someone on our team is connected in some way, whether a direct family member or someone that they knew. And so when there are domestic violence issues, like, our team is connected. There's also a lot of times that our folks are dealing with domestic violence issues themselves. When you're hiring folks from the community, you're going to experience the challenges of the community that we're also trying to fight. We can't fight these challenges without not realizing that the same people that are being impacted are also some of those that are on our staff as well. Yeah. Our mental health, we talk significantly about it, but some of the ambassadors and some of the staff members have confided in me about, having increased anxiety or depression or imposter syndrome, right? Just like all of these different things. So, seeing those effects and also too, people are losing loved ones to COVID directly. So there's kind of the immediate, death and impacts of COVID, but there's also the side effects, the economic, the mental health, the domestic violence, and all of those things have impacted our team in different ways. And then when it comes to the racial reckoning that we're in right now, we recently hired someone who happens to live in Kenosha and lives, just a few minutes away from where that 17-year-old murdered 2 people and injured another. I think all of us, Milwaukee is about 40 miles away from Kenosha, but it still felt very, very close. It felt very much in our backyard. And I know for me, Jacob Blake shooting himself, we're starting to see those shootings happen more and more frequently, but we're also seeing this rise in, groups like the Proud Boys and white militia groups. And I think that part, really kind of scared a lot of us. And then also what that means doing this work too, knowing we do this work and knowing that people are driving across state lines, murdering people for saying that Black lives simply not matter more than anyone else, matter, and people are getting murdered for saying that. So I think it's jarring. It's terrifying. It's, this has probably been the hardest year of my professional career ever, lots of tears. But I think at the same time, it also really strengthens, I think, all of our resolve, and that like, we have to keep fighting. We gotta dig a little bit deeper to find that energy to get out of bed today, even when the world is telling us and giving us every reason not to. So it's I think it's giving us that little fuel to kind of get over these last few days. And I think it's not easy and it's draining, but it's I think put a lot of things in perspective for us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. How can our listeners support your work?
Yeah, I always give people 3 different ways. One, because we are a year-round organization, we always need funding on a year-round basis, not just in the presidential years. So if people are interested in supporting our work on a year-round basis, you can go to our website at blockbyblock.org, BLOCBYBLOC. And there's a donate page. We have our nonpartisan fund, we have our action fund, and then we now have a PAC for any federal work as well. But understanding not everyone has disposable income right now. Do you know folks or organizations that we should get connected to? Whether it's you have a cousin that does a podcast in his basement and you think I'd be great, or you have a rich uncle, or you're like, hey, there's a really great organization in Georgia doing similar work and you should get connected. We love to get connected to other folks. But then also knowing not everyone has a wealthy network. And so the last thing that everyone can do is amplify our content. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. There's been an internal discussion if we'll get on TikTok. I don't know if I can handle that. But we're on the socials, and I think it's important, one, to amplify our content because it broadens our message and our reach. But two, it's really important in this moment right now to amplify the lived experiences of organizers and activists, because right now there are some really tough conversations that are happening that need to be happening. Everyone's talking to their racist uncle or cousin at the dinner table, and using and being able to amplify the lived experiences that are, that we tell through our social media. It can be a good conversation starter as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. Can you share some of your hopes for the future, maybe, if you can find hope?
Yeah. At this time? My hopes for the future is that something that a lot of us say is that we want to organize ourselves out of a job, right? Like, I would love to live in a world where white supremacy doesn't exist, so I don't need to have a job, right? And, I would love for us to do all of that work where something like Block isn't needed because everything is balanced. And we have a long way to go for that. And, I think for me, I'm really, really passionate about leadership development and trainings. And that's why it's really woven into a lot of what we do, because I'm really, really hopeful for the future. I'm 31, but I'm hopeful for the young people. I feel like I'm no longer a youth, right? Like, I'm no longer a young person that people talk about. When people talk about young people, they're talking about this TikTok generation that's organizing through this platform in a really fascinating way. So I'm really hopeful for young folks. There's a quote that a lot of us say, and I think kind of ground ourselves in saying, we are our ancestors' wildest dreams. Something like Block wouldn't have existed 30, 40 years ago. So we are our ancestors' wildest dreams. And I think that's a really good grounding. But I also need to tack on another part of that quote of our future generations will be my wildest dreams. And so I will not solve everything that I want. My job right now is to lay the foundation and just to do what I can to keep the ball rolling for the next generation, even when I get frustrated with how long change is taking to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Where do you see maybe specifically you going in the future, or even Block going in the future? If you could look, maybe 3, 5, 10 years down the line, do you have any specific dreams or hopes about that?
For me, I don't know where I'm going to be, to be honest. It's strange because I'm such a type A personality. I love to plan. I like lists. I like checklists. I like all of that. But I never expected to be doing this work. I entered college thinking I was going to be a doctor doing pre-med, and one day I was going to do Doctors Without Borders, right? So I stopped making plans for my life because every time I did, it drastically changed. So now I'm just rolling with it. And I'm very happy with where I am. But that also means I don't know where this is going to take me. I tell the team that Block is very, very close to me and close to my heart, and it will always be my baby. But at the same time, I don't want to be, the executive director for 10 to 15 years, because I don't know if that's healthy for an organization. And I want to be able to provide for the next, vision and to be implemented. So I know I won't be at Block for 15 years, maybe 5 or 6 or so. We'll see. But something that always was kind of a dream of mine is to see Block expand to other cities and maybe other states. 2020, again, put a damper in our plans, but we wanted to expand to the Racine area, which is very close to Kenosha. And, we still have those plans. We're hoping that when we're able to be back out in the field and it's safe to do so, we'll start to expand to other places in Wisconsin. And like I said, people have asked us to come to other states. So we'll see how that works in other states. And I didn't anticipate, people to say, come to this state, come to this city so quickly. But we're excited to explore what that looks like. And hopefully, we can have Block affiliates and chapters in all 50 states one day.
That would be amazing. Yeah. Best of luck with that. I hope it happens. I'll keep my fingers
Me too.
crossed. Yeah. So I'm wondering too about just in general how this work has maybe impacted you personally and how it's shaped you, how it's shaped just your life, your identity.
Yeah, I think it's shaped me in ways where like I've had to find my voice more. I've always been outspoken, don't get me wrong. But like kind of standing in it and owning it a little bit more. It's not me saying, "Hey, I have an opinion. I hope people listen to me." It's I'm the executive director of a really important organization in 2020. And there's power in that, there's leverage in that, and having to stand in that and to own that. But that also means I have a lot of responsibility. That means I have to call out, when I see something problematic. And if that means calling out our progressive friends and their blind spots, I have an obligation because it's no longer just my opinion. I have a duty and an obligation to my team and to my community. So it made me be a little bit more bold and unapologetic in a way where it's not always comfortable, but it's like, I have to do this. This is the responsibility I have, and I'm going to do this because I owe it to my team to do that. I think I'm learning a lot about myself. I'm also feel like I'm 31, so I'm still in that phase where you're like, who am I as like a person, right? It's like another way of you. I feel like you do that in your when you turn like 18 and like 21, but like I feel like I'm doing that again as I'm growing in this role. I've never been an executive director before Block, never had to fundraise to this level. And so just feeling and figuring out kind of how I maneuver these new experiences, who I am as a leader, reflecting on how I'm showing up as a leader, as a person, and then kind of digging deep and doing that work and that self-care with yourself and creating boundaries that I never really did, which explain a lot. And so being able to establish those boundaries and, telling folks, no, it's too late in the day. Send me an email. I'll get back to you tomorrow. No, don't send me a DM on Instagram if it's work related. Email me, right? It's being able to establish those boundaries. And really, I think for me, finding, I don't want to say like finding purpose, but finding kind of, I don't know, like how I'm showing up and grounding myself in how I want to live my life, not just for work. Because a lot of times work consumes me and I am my work, but having to find other things and saying like, what do I want to get out of life that is not centered in work, and that I deserve the same things that I'm fighting for. I deserve a healthy, long, thriving, fulfilling life too. And just because I'm fighting for it, that doesn't mean I also don't deserve an 8-hour day instead of a 16-hour day, for example. So having to really kind of check myself that I'm also a participant in this movement and not always an executive director.
Absolutely. Yeah. Has there been anything in particular that has helped you get yourself in that space? It just sounds like a lot of really emotionally heavy work. So I'm wondering what's helped you, get to the point where you can find your voice, where you can be bolder, where you can stand up and take, responsibility for things.
I think I just in some ways stopped caring, and that sounds very strange. When you're constantly being attacked from different angles, I never thought I'd be spending a lot of 2020 talking about white militia and having to plan around that, right? And so what used to be big deals are not as much anymore because it shifts your perspective because things are so drastically bad right now. So when you kind of have that perspective, you're like, oh, I'm going to stand up in this meeting and say something because you can't tell me anything because I'm already terrified of the Proud Boys and white militia. So what you have to say in this meeting is not going to be nearly as bad as all the other trauma and all the other things that I'm experiencing right now. And I think being able to talk about it more, and being honest, continuing to not back down to what I realized that I didn't realize at the time is that people were watching. And so when I felt that I was standing up by myself and being isolated and alone, people were watching, and that gave them permission that they could do the same. And so then you just kind of start to continue to stand up, and you continue to raise your voice. And you start to destigmatize it. You start to kind of like help people walk through your thought process instead of just, I'm mad at you for this. It's like, all right, let me tell you why I called this out. Let's talk about imposter syndrome and how that, impacts Black women. And let me tell you about how this is manifesting in me and how I'm showing up right now. So even kind of having to walk people through, so people are just seeing, oh, Angela's angry at X, Y, and Z. No, let me peel back the layers of why this is so offensive and how I have to do this emotional labor to tell you all this, right? And so I think being able just to be honest with those feelings, and that's really vulnerable. It's not easy. I don't want listeners to think like just keep speaking your truth and it's going to be easy. It's not. I just recently saw a quote from Eleanor Roosevelt that she said, "Do it in your heart to be true," and because essentially you're going to get criticized for it anyway, so you might as well do the right thing. And I think that's just important to continue to do. But that doesn't mean that after I do it, that I just go home and I'm like, oh, I'm great. I'll cry about it. And I'm like, that meeting felt crappy and I need to cry it out. And like, now I'm labeled as the angry Black woman. And there are times you have to decompress that and process that. But, you still kind of got to figure out if you can get up and do the same thing all over again and how you're processing that too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you mind talking about imposter syndrome? It's one of our favorite topics on the podcast. Maybe how it's
I think I'm digging a lot into, how I'm showing up in the world, how I am manifesting like certain things that I may or may not realize. So I think about it, and I think for me, I think there's just a lot of pressure on the work that I do. I know, and we started this conversation, that when an election doesn't go a particular way, everyone always wants to blame Black folks. We can carry an election, and people are like, yeah, that's cool, great. But like no one ever really gives us the credit that we deserve. And so I think a lot of times we feel that, or at least I do, I feel like I have to work those 16-hour days. I can't stop when everybody else stops and they're like, oh, I'm going to go cook for my family and spend family time. I'm like, no, I have to send these extra 15 emails before I close my laptop, and I feel like there's an added pressure. And it took a lot to get to where I am. There are times I literally I felt like I was screaming in the middle of a room to have my voice heard sometimes. And the fact that for the last several days and last several weeks, I'm working 12 hours minimum, more like probably 16 or so or more a day. I'll wake up, I'll work, I go to bed. And yet sometimes I feel like I'm running circles on some people, but yet they always land and get a cushy gig somehow every time. And so it makes me, I think I unfairly compare myself, right? Like they're always landing, they're doing mediocre work. Am I not doing enough? I need to work harder. But somebody said something to me that offered kind of a reframe of imposter syndrome, and it's oppressor impact syndrome, which like completely shifted my thinking, because it's like, I'm great. Like I have a great work ethic. Like this isn't due to a lack of self-confidence in me. It's literally how white supremacy, capitalism, the patriarchy are implying these unrealistic standards to make myself not feel like I'm good enough. And that's not a thing reflective of my own self-confidence. That's literally society, and like it's the impact literally of my oppressors that lead me to bear this weight. So I thought it was an interesting kind of reframe, and I try to share that as well, that it's not something that is something that we are always responsible for. It's literally being surrounded by all of these messages in society that are telling us that we're not good enough.
Yeah. Wow, that's really powerful. I just got chills listening to you describe that. It must be really liberating to be able to, reframe it like that. I mean,
in some ways, right? Like it's a journey. I don't know how you fully get rid of it. I don't know if you ever do get rid of, imposter syndrome, but I think sometimes, like if you're anxious or if you're feeling down, sometimes it's just like, oh, why am I anxious? Why am I feeling down? Like we add that to ourselves because we think it's our responsibility. Yeah. And so I think by offering that reframe, it kind of takes that responsibility off, and you're like, this is what society is telling me. No wonder I feel this way, and I'm going to honor my feelings, but I also know that I'm not responsible. This isn't me not loving myself enough. This is literally being impacted on me. So it does take away some of that weight. But it's still, a journey of having to figure out and navigate imposter syndrome. It doesn't take it away completely, but I think it reframes it enough where it's a little bit more manageable.
Yeah, definitely. We have one more question for you that we'd like to end our podcast episodes with. We ask all our guests this, but before we get to that, is there anything else that you want to make sure to share with the listeners?
Yeah, I think all I would offer is that 2020 has been a really challenging year, and we don't know how long it's going to last. Like, yes, 2020 will run out, but we don't know what 2021 is going to bring. And we need to make sure that we're showing up as full people. We're honoring our feelings. We're not trying to suppress them. I think hopefully this pandemic is allowing people to dig deep in who they are and how they're communicating, how they're being effective communicators, but also how they're being kind to themselves and offering themselves grace too. It's a big thing that I learned for myself is like, no, I said I was going to decompress all weekend, but I took some phone calls. Offer yourself some grace. You do what you need in that moment, and lean into that, because I think, it's just been such a tough year that we have to make sure that we're not only supporting others, but supporting ourselves too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This might actually take us into our last question really well. So this podcast is about learning. It's about having difficult conversations that we don't typically have maybe in our everyday lives. So with that in mind, what is maybe one thing that you've learned over the course of this past year specifically, either about yourself, about your work, about the world, one thing that you've learned that you can kind of reflect on? And how it's impacted you?
I feel like I've learned a lot. I think the big things that stand out to me that I'm still reflecting and digging deeper into is how I show up in times of crisis and chaos. There are times, oddly enough, I feel very, very focused. And it's kind of like in times of crisis, like, okay, what needs to get done? Tunnel vision, we need to do X, Y, and Z. And part of me is just like, is there something wrong with me? Like, the world is on fire and I'm okay right now. And I think I'm able to like do what needs to get done in the immediate short term. And then I have to kind of follow up and make sure that I'm going back and actually processing those feelings that like I didn't necessarily have time to in that moment because I'm literally dealing with the crisis. So I think being able to find that balance of like, how do you continue and do what needs to get done when the whole year feels like a crisis? But because it's like I'm a high functioning anxious executive in some points, right? Like that can be great for the short term, but it's not good for the long term if you're not able to actually process your feelings and take that time to do so. So I think it's a friendly reminder for me. But yeah, it was something very strange that I was like, how am I actually oddly calm when I keep dealing with all of these crises in this moment? And also understanding that like when you're used to trauma, you kind of you're used to the other, waiting for the other shoe to drop, I think, in some ways. So I think that oddly enough, childhood trauma worked for me. I can actually use it as a way to kind of manage crisis and chaos a little bit better, but having to also remind myself to process those feelings too.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Super important.
Thank you.
Angela, thank you so much for everything you shared.
Thank you
today.
so much.
This has been
I love
wonderful.
it. Thank you.
Yeah. Appreciate that. This episode of the Unconventional Dyad podcast is sponsored by Anchor. Anchor is the easiest way to make a podcast. The most important thing about Anchor is that it's free. They also have creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you, so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. It's everything you need to make a podcast all in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started.
Hello, Unconventional Dyad podcast listeners. We are so excited that you are joining the conversation with us. If you're liking what you're hearing and you would like to support the podcast, there are a few different ways to do that. We have a Patreon page now, so if you visit patreon.com/unconventionaldyad, you can support us through 4 different support tiers. You can also support us through the Anchor app. There's a support function, and you can choose from 3 different tiers, from as little as 99 cents per month. We really hope that you are liking the content so far. You can also check out our website where we post weekly blogs that you can comment on, and we hope that you join in the conversation with us. Let us know what you think.